Okay, our last session for today is a panel session where it's your chance to grill these people at the trust. And lay of known on them. So starting from my right, we have Nick Burt, who's the CEO of Facilities Management Association. So I'm going to ask him really tricky questions about why aren't all the facilities managers getting a clean indoor air to start with. Next we have Richard Vidia from University of Sydney, whose expertise is internal comfort. Next we have Jit Banagaram. Hopefully that's something that's really recognisable. From Amazon Web Services, but whose expertise is a little bit, I think, what we need in terms of how do we develop strategic objectives and collaborative approaches to transition spaces. Is that okay for you, Jit? Sorry. Amanda, you met previously from CSIRO. Amanda's been involved in research regarding indoor air quality and health impacts in the UK, US, Canada and Australia. John, we also met previously, and I'm going to ask him some tricky questions about what reasons we should be measuring and what climate change impacts we expect. And we have Robin, who's standing in for Greg Bell, who's Director for Operations Infrastructure at that Department of Education in Queensland. So I'm going to ask a few questions first, but it's working. But just to remind you of the 5 big questions that were presented at the beginning of the day about indoor air quality health, indoor air quality thermal comfort and energy, indoor air quality climate change, indoor air quality and dynamic optimisation, and then collaboration and transformation. So my first thing is not to drop things. Okay, we mentioned, it was mentioned earlier today about episodic events such as bushfires and bush smoke, etc. And as part of my research in resilience, looking at hazards can be fast-moving hazards or slow-moving hazards. Now, I'm wondering whether for indoor air quality and health, we need to consider different aspects of health, such as fast and slow health impacts, episodic and chronic health impacts, and visible and non-visible health impacts. And I was wondering whether anybody on the panel would like to talk a little bit about how do we determine or define what health is when we're talking about indoor air quality and health?
I'll get to all rolling. I think that the Morwell mine fire back in 2014 was one of the first examples of a sort of a really sort of longer term exposure to smoke for a community, and the 10-year follow-up that's happened since then has demonstrated that there have been some short-term health outcomes versus some long-term. And I think that the 2019-2020 smoke from that bushfire was fairly unusual in terms of the length of exposure that had occurred. And again, we saw acute effects, respiratory to longer term effects through to cardiovascular, etc. But I think that the challenge with some of the more difficult health outcomes, such as cancer, it's such a complex exposure pathway that it's actually quite difficult to pinpoint exactly where those exposures have happened and whether it's indoor or whether it's outdoor or it's occupational. But I do think that we should be more cognitive of the fact that every part of the body is now responding to poor air quality, and I think there's a huge amount of literature now globally that is demonstrating that all parts of the human body are susceptible. And I think that given that we spend so much time indoors, it's incredibly important that we do something to improve that problem.
So in that sense, Nick, I was wondering if you would like to, whether your members, the facilities management members, have particular health concerns or occupant wellbeing concerns that have been discussed within the SMA or?
Yeah, thanks. Good question. I think that our members have a growing need to improve the quality of the indoor environment. There's no question about that. And, that spins off into a whole range of different spaces. I think there would be questions starting to be asked of any client of their provider if, there was massive breakouts of health compromising disease in the workplace, the same as there might be, through use of poor quality water or anything else. I guess, sort of the obvious example which has flowed through, probably a couple of decades ago was when there was little Legionella outbreaks here and there. And so that then raises the awareness of people to risks that are out there. And then that then flows through into how do we better manage those situations, and a whole lot of interventions, both regulatory and from a private sector, were put in place when those types of events were occurring. Not familiar with some of those in the Victorian context, and so I think it's just a matter of time before that flows through from the most recent brand of health-related issues which are occurring in the workplace.
Take this in a slightly different direction. So when you start thinking about the incentives and reasons for improving air quality, I think it's really good to then sort of start tracking back to what are the drivers for all of the different actors involved. And I'll relay a conversation I had by chance with Director of Sustainable Finance at one of the banks. So his job, their job, is about trying to find ways of lending money and looking at what are the terms or different terms you might use for more sustainable projects. And the conversation turned to neighbours, and it turned to buildings. And where the discussion went was that there is an incentive currently for building owners to make their buildings more energy efficient using the NABERS sort of rating system, because if they can do that, they can show that, and NABERS is a valid and well-recognised measurement system, they can charge more money for their rent. And at the same time, they can also, their building becomes more valuable because they can charge more money for their rent. And so when you start thinking about those different layers of incentives and drivers that might get people to start thinking about IAQ, it's sort of interesting to start. There is definitely health, but what you also tend to find is other drivers are financial drivers, and there's some really interesting areas to explore. Very interested to see where your work goes in that regard.
So following on from that, I'm wondering if you could explain to us what's the driver for Education Queensland to want to improve, there's a mic coming for you, to improve the indoor air quality of schools, because in essence it's not an economic driver in the sense of increasing the rent space or increasing the value of the properties per se. There are other drivers. So what drives Education Queensland to be concerned?
I guess probably what drives me personally, more than the department, is that throughout from COVID and the lessons that we learnt as a result of that, we didn't want to necessarily forget. So there may not be a huge driver within the department. I think it comes back to lack of awareness or education on the side effects and impacts of poor air quality, which is something I guess we're trying to work heavily with QUT to improve that education aspect of it, because I think that will then influence or ultimately change the policies, which we're also trying to implement. But I think the two sides of the equation are very important for education. moving forward. So I don't know that it's necessarily, obviously, we want the best outcomes for our students and whatever that means in its very broad stroke. And I guess having good air quality is ultimately the best for the students that are in the schools, plus the teachers that are educating them, and then our broader workforce as well.
Right, thank you. Kind of question one on the board also relates to, are we proposing to report on the right pollutants? I know, Tunga, you have a question about one of the pollutants that were on the list that we were reporting on, total VOCs. Do you want to tell us what your concerns about whether we should or shouldn't be measuring TVOCs? Are they important?
Yeah, I did one of my favorites, TVOC. I'm working on this for 30 years now. You can measure TVOC, but you must know exactly how it is defined and what is it good for. First and probably most important, TVOC is not a health-related parameter, but many institutions mistreat it as or misuse it as a health-related parameter. It's a screening parameter. Point one. Point two, there's a countless numbers of methods for measuring TVOC. If you give me 10 data sets of TVOC, I'm almost sure that 10 different measurement methods and 10 different methods of calculating TVOC are behind this. This is some parameter, and the problem with TVOC is that it's often, as I said, used as a health-related parameter, and people define TVOC, for example, this 500 microgram per cubic meter, or many others. I can give you dozens of different of values, but they do not define the method or the analytical method behind it. So I can only give the message here: if you want to use it, do it as a screening parameter, but be very, very careful in doing this, and you must be very sure what you are doing.
Okay, thank you. I'm just going to go through a number of questions that I've written down first, and then they'll be open to the floor in a moment. So I'm going to ask Richard next, because the second question there talks about achieving a balance in building performance with respect to indoor air quality, thermal comfort, and the need to be energy efficient from a greenhouse gas perspective. Does that question itself imply that we should trade off one against the other, and we can't have the optimal of all of those?
The received wisdom is that there's a trade-off. You can have this or that. But for the last 6 years, I was chairing an international energy agency, Annex 69, which was looking at low energy and passive design solutions to the climate crisis that we're all confronting. And I guess the strongest message that came out from that big international collaboration was that mixed mode design strategies have got huge potential and largely overlooked. And in my mind, it seems pretty obvious. It's a win-win for both air quality and for thermal comfort and sustainability as well. So I don't think they need to be
Mutually exclusive, or trade one against the other.
Yep.
Okay, thank you. I like the next question perhaps to go to Tunga again, because one of the key areas you look at is the impact of climate change on indoor air quality. Is there anything in particular that you think we collectively may have overlooked or maybe sneaking up behind us regarding how will climate change impact on indoor air quality?
Yeah, I'm not sure that I can respond to this question from your perspective. We have a big project in Germany. What is the impact of climate change on Central Europe, let's say? And unfortunately, we had a big heat wave in 2003, which was exactly 20 years ago, with 50,000 or 60,000 excessive deaths in Europe, and nobody learned from that. So when it was over, people continued with business as usual, like the dinosaurs here. And I like the cartoon very much. Well, we are facing the same situation now. We have, there's a UN report released last month, I think, saying very clearly, forget about the 1.5 degree thing. So we will face something at 2100 between 2.7 degrees Celsius and 3 degrees Celsius. And that's a big difference. So this makes clear that more heat waves will come. It will be maybe colder in Europe, more hot in Australia, and more humid in Australia. And the European buildings are not currently designed to protect people from heat waves, from cold, from freezing. If the Atlantic flow breaks down, which is now that's a high probability that will be so. I think 30% in the year 2040. I read a recent Nature paper on that. It was very depressing to see that. So to make that clear, we made predictions for the year 2100, and we found if our buildings are not retrofitted and we have no air conditioning now, that many people will suffer, and the vulnerable people probably severely suffer or even die if we do not take action now, if it's not already too late. So I think what we need, what society needs, is new building designs, artificial ventilation, but this costs energy. I know this. I'm not quite sure about the situation here. You have more air conditioning than we have in Europe. But we have to do something in both terms: building design, and better ventilation, more cooling.
So one of the studies that we did or the air conditioning industry did along with Patrick from Stantec 2 years ago was modelling the impact of future climate on hospitals in Australia. And some of the key findings are that the energy load, both in terms of the peak demand and the total energy consumption of hospitals all around Australia, with the exception of Tasmania, will increase with climate change. And that some of the technologies used for HVAC systems in Australia now won't actually work in the future because of the change in the humidity, for example. So there's a number of things. So I'm wondering, wanting to ask Amanda a question relating to climate change. So you mentioned that the Centre for Safe Air are looking at trying to determine what safe evacuation havens there could be, what are the criteria to protect people from smoke hazards in a bushfire thing. But I wonder whether in working out such a framework, we also need to think about, are they the same criteria to protect us from bushfire smoke as an evacuation centre as what we need if the evacuation centre is for a cyclone or a flood or for a heat wave. So do we need a multiple hazard framework for determining where are our evacuation or safe zones?
Yes, I think I'm hearing more in the space around the creation of resilience centres. And so, I think we've seen the heat wave requirements for people to go somewhere cool, same with bushfires. But I also think that, there's been a lot of flooding in Australia and a lot of people have had to leave their homes. And so again, is there somewhere safe that they can go for that? And cyclones as well. So I think, this resilience centre is probably something that we should be moving towards, rather than thinking of each catastrophe as an individual thing. I think climate change is the umbrella, and I think, a lot of it will be getting worse as time goes on, unfortunately.
So as part of that, then it's fairly common in emergency services to think of these evacuation centres. But if climate change is going to have longer heat waves, and if it takes, for example, after a flood, it takes a year or more to get back to your house. So the evacuation centre per se, or the alternative accommodation centres, are no longer just for a few hours or for a day or for 2 days. So should part of the resilience strategy and the health strategy also be looking at improving the resilience of all the existing buildings so we don't need to evacuate as frequently anyway? Any comments on that from anyone?
I mean, I do think that, we need to think about how that would be funded and not base that burden on the individual. I think that would be my one concern. And if we move away from a sort of a more government-led, here's access to the facility that you can use. And I don't know how that would be supported. But I do agree that each individual's residence should be a safe haven.
Yeah, thanks.
I think we're in the right city for this, but a number of years ago there was a whole lot of stuff in basements in office buildings in this town that no longer sits in the basements of buildings and is upper floor stuff now. And so I think that the built environment continually evolves itself to deal with the resilience of the time. And so I think the first thing is bringing it to the awareness of the built environment, the ownership structure, the operating structure, so that then something can be done about that and to remediate it. But I think in many respects, this is a new and emerging problem, and I would suggest that not even all of our members would be front of mind on things like climate resilience and so forth because of the other array of focus points that they have on a day-to-day basis. So, as an association, I see our role very much as starting that conversation and educating, and then ultimately the built environment being such a highly competitive space, certainly in the private sector, that people strive to evolve to something better. And that's just the nature of the economics of the thing. So I think that will happen by virtue of the environment that we operate in.
Perhaps one of the resilience things from a household perspective is an example where we could promote collaboration in that, for example, if we want homes to be able to be mechanically ventilated so you can shut the doors and windows to protect against smoke, but if at the same time there's power blackouts because of bushfires, for example, how are those ventilation systems going to run? And in order to do that, if you have PVs and battery storage systems, those things need to be able to run when the grid is off. But a lot of the current rules say that if the grid goes down, your battery system and your PV inverter also has to turn on. So it's sort of one of those things where the interaction between energy policy and building policy and health policy, we need all of those things to be working together. So I was wanting to ask you, Robin, regarding I guess the fourth question in a sense about can public buildings, are looking at education buildings, knowing that a lot of Queensland schools are, or most of them are naturally ventilated and they have split aircon systems which don't actually bring in outdoor air. What's the solution between providing the thermal comfort in terms of buildings and the air quality that split systems can make worse in some senses?
I'm not sure I'd say that most of our buildings are naturally ventilated. We do have a good portion of mechanical ventilation, and that includes the fresh air intake within our schools. But you are correct, it does. There is a challenge around that thermal comfort. During the COVID years, we encouraged them to turn the aircon on and to open the windows slightly so that we were trying to bring some fresh air into the spaces. Longer term, that is not going to be the strategy. That was a strategy at a point in time. our intention is to change our design standards for our mechanical ventilation to bring fresh air, while also maintaining that thermal comfort within those spaces, because obviously we live in Queensland and our portfolio is very diverse, lots of locations. You're not going to be in Mount Isa and just want to open the windows. You are going to want that comfort. So for the comfort of our students and our staff, it just wouldn't be acceptable for us to not consider thermal comfort. Obviously, the challenge with that is the increased energy consumption that comes with that. But I think it's a payoff. I would prefer, I think our students would prefer and our teachers would prefer the thermal comfort of the mechanical ventilation, and then the policy setters or the infrastructure people, I think, would like to know that the air quality within those spaces. And we do have lots of advocates as well in different sectors that are also promoting air quality too. But I don't know that it's at the forefront of most of our students' minds or our educators' minds. They're all about educating the students. So yeah, I don't know if that really answers the question, but
it raises lots of questions. You are thinking
I could follow up some of those threads. Schools Infrastructure New South Wales was looking at exactly these issues in some of their newer constructions. I think they call it the Full Classrooms program. And so,
I think Queensland is cool schools.
Two schools.
Yes.
So they were hybrid ventilation designs, designed to be very effectively naturally ventilated when the outdoor thermal conditions were amenable. And then there was ceiling fans as well, high quality, low noise, and a big sort of spatial spread of moving air as the second tier. Natural ventilation, then the fans, and then the final solution was the slick system, but with some makeup air from outside. And but the whole system relied on I would say, common sense of the teacher to actually step through those in that sequence. But we discovered very, very quickly that was not how they were being used. Those classrooms were switched on to aircon immediately at the beginning of the day and stayed on aircon regardless of the outdoor weather conditions. So I guess that does, maybe a facilities manager could have an opinion on this, but it sounds like it would need to be automated. You'd have a demand control ventilation system that would set through in a logical sort of algorithm through those systems. The technology's there, but
yeah, that's definitely what we found in
Same story,
Queensland, was that we were relying too heavily on human intervention, essentially. We need a system that will work autonomously based on the environmental conditions. We did start trialing a few things, like particularly in winter. So in winter in Queensland, it's not particularly cold, but teachers, when they go into the classrooms, they're not going to be inclined to open windows. They're also not going to be inclined to turn on any mechanical ventilation because they don't want to be cold. So they're going in and they're doing nothing. They had a nice sealed room, it's warm, that's what they're after, it's thermal comfort. But we had a look at some fresh air fans that had CO2 monitoring to force the to force the fresh air into the space, regardless of what the teacher was doing in the environment. It mightn't be the ultimate solution, but I think something like that is what certainly we need in an education setting. So it's something that they don't have to think about. They can come in and...
I'll make a comment on that before you add it. So it's interesting how that's opposite to people who work in offices. So education is saying you need more mechanical, automatic intervention and take it out of the hands of occupants. Occupants in offices are saying, we don't want the mechanical engineer to be determining what the temperature in my office space is, etc. I want more personal control of that. That's an interesting dichotomy between the two different types. you want to say something?
Yeah, I was going to say that exactly your point. I know that we've just moved into a new premium office complex. It's a shared office environment, and they have, gone exactly the reverse. So put controls around the place where people can intervene with the proposition. In our last office building, we actually had natural ventilation, the ability to influence that ourselves. So I think that the world's changing in that space particularly. But the one other point which I think is worth noting is that some of my members would tell me that the most effective way to operate a building is to get rid of the people from inside it.
That's interesting. So I think those things about the needs of occupants versus the needs of the owners of buildings in terms of the energy used to run it, the simplicity of running it, but also in schools, as in some offices, it's the power between children and teachers, for example, but also the demographic difference. I know in a lot of schools the average age of teachers is over 45, and there are more female teachers and male teachers, that the different thermal comfort needs of the different demographics in classrooms. And it's the older, I'll say this as an older woman, it's the older women who have the power in the classroom to whether to open or close the windows or turn things off. So I wonder whether some monitors, so actually having like the stoplight monitors or something that everybody in a classroom or an office building can see what it is and have some more direct say, if not control, in knowing temperature and CO2 examples. Any comments?
The group difference in comfort requirements that you're referring to, we've worked out was about 2 degrees. 2 degrees cooler for women at perimenopause stage of life. That's if you're familiar with the P&D curve, Thaget's famous P&D PPD, that pushes you from about 5% predicted dissatisfied out to about 35%. So that's a big effect. Well, one of the.
And that's that difference in thermal comfort. Does that also relate to the difference in how CO2, for example, impacts on individuals? So if the guidelines was 800 parts per million as a absolute limit for, will 800 ppm affect me differently to what it would my 35-year-old son or my 10-year-old grandson? Is there science in that? So you're shaking your head, Lydia. Is that no, there's no science, or there is science and it's not a thing?
Yeah. No, 800 is not based on health risk. 800 and CO2 is based being proxy. Proxy for ventilation and proxy for infection transmission. So that proxy is worked out based on a specific scenario, which is a classroom of 25 kids and so typical parameters and COVID, the current virus. So for this, it is 800 and the parameters of ventilation rate 14 liters per second per person. But if we had sort of more infectious pathogen or people spending more time, because this was 1 hour, then the parameters would be different. So that's why the 800 is not sort of kind of set in stone for other places, but it is something based on this scenario.
Okay, thank you. Please.
Yeah, I can also comment this. We have a system in Germany which is not too bad, which is not based on proxy, as Lydia said, which is important, to be honest. We have hygiene-based regulations in Germany, especially regarding CO2, and this says everything below 1,000 is okay, and everything higher than 2,000 is unacceptable. No way. And there's some region in between the 1,000 and the 2,000. It depends. If it's, let's say, 1,200 in a school building or so, it's not important. You can easily survive that. But then the measures you have to take depend on the level. If it's close to 2,000, then open the window. If it's slightly above 1,000, then no need for action. And this, not in schools, to be honest, but because then there are so many opinions on that, but parents, the teachers, the kids, and whatever, and so on. But the system works nicely in Germany with this 3-stage or 2-stage system, 1,000, 2,000, and so on.
So yeah, I have a question for you, Jet. My understanding of your expertise is in innovative solutions and engaging stakeholders to move forward to transitioning to something new, something different. So you've heard all the complexity of the issues that the indoor air quality people are looking at. Does anything come to your mind as, the top 3 things, for example, that as a group we should be collaboratively working on if we want to change the way we occupy buildings, the way we design and build them, the way we operate them, in order to maximise human health?
Wow, okay.
I know, it's not the easiest one for you.
I think I'll answer that in a couple of different ways. I think if I look at the theme for today, it's been about how might you change the mind of regulators to really take this issue seriously. And when I think about other programs that I've been involved with, where we try to tackle that same sort of problem, sort of think about things that Ted spoke about earlier and Bronwyn also spoke about, which is how do you distill the problem down to something that's really simple and something that is easily communicatable. And like I always just talk about sound bites. If you can distill the problem down into a sound bite and put that out into the ether, you're very successful. You are getting successful when that sound bite starts coming back. And I think some of the stuff being very honest with everyone in the room, I really didn't know anything about indoor air quality until probably the start of this year, a little bit earlier than that. But if I track what's happened over the course of this year, the number of politicians who seem to be talking about this issue, the number of government officials who seem to be talking about this issue, it seems to be increasing. And there are elements of the story that seem to be coming through. So the 90% thing has really seemed to resonate. The water is regulated, buildings are regulated, but external air is not is regulated, but internal is not. That seemed to be coming through. But I think what I would be looking for is then the so what. So what do you do? It feels like this movement is getting to a point where it's getting better to clearly start to articulate a problem. But what I am seeing again from today and also my research, it just sort of feels like it's a bit disjointed about what the solutions might be. When I first started looking at this as an issue, I thought, okay, how do I learn about this stuff? I started talking to architects, and I actually started reading portions of the NCC. And I walked away going, and actually from architects and from the NCC, thought, I don't understand what all these people are on about, because it feels like it's hard. And it's only through conversations with people like Lydia and others, you start going, oh, right, it's not. But I don't think there's a clearly articulated message as to why it's not. No. For me, that would be the starting point, and that then gives you the rallying point through which the move moves forward. The other piece that I've noticed, again, trying to drive change programs is its incentives and understanding what are the incentives that drive all the different actors in the room. And so if I think about the point I raised earlier about neighbours and making a building more sustainable gets you richer, that is a good soundbite and a good way to approach building owners, because at the end of the day, they're asset management companies. They buy and sell, but they buy other things to make money. If indoor air quality suddenly makes your building more valuable, then that's going to lead to an action. Currently, it's probably looked at maybe more at cost. And then you start looking within education, it's the outcome for kids and all the rest of it. It's finding those different the incentives and the pain points, and then working out where you might move forward from.
Okay, so if I put all those things together, and if on my sound bites were indoor air quality is not regulated, that matters because it costs $560 billion a year in Australia's GDP from illnesses, etc. And what we can do about it is make it mandatory for all public buildings to disclose their indoor air quality publicly. They're my three points. So I asked Nick, for example, if it was mandatory to disclose a range of indoor air quality parameters in all public buildings. So we're talking, I classify public buildings as anything that's not residential, and as well as residential buildings that are rented as opposed to owner-occupied.
Sure.
How do you think that would go down with your membership?
Our membership doesn't have a problem with disclosure at all, because that fuels the conversation about how do you make improvement and how do you build a case for investment in improvement. And I think, I guess that draws back to one point which I think I was reflecting on during one of the earlier presentations around seeing using the OH&S or the work safe legislation as a mechanism. And I don't disagree with anything that was said by any stretch, and I think there's an imperative for some sort of legal determination to sort of support heading down that path. But the thing which I've been reflecting on over the last number of months is that if it's not building regulation, then it will sit with the tenants, it won't sit with the owner. And if it sits with the owner, something has to happen and they have control to be able to make those things happen. My concern with having something which sits with the responsibility sits with the tenants, so, a large employer, say, that they only have a degree of influence over the engineering outcomes of a building or the ability to influence that. And I think that then it becomes really difficult to have the conversation about reasonably practicable. Is it reasonably practicable to, have a level of influence over an ownership structure of a building that you don't have to alter it significantly enough to improve the indoor air? Or is it reasonably practical to say, we're going to put our employees in a safer building when we sign a new lease in 3 years, and that means that those employees are putting up with 3 years of crap air in the meantime? So I think, and I don't think either one's right, I think it's something which we're meant to work around in terms of a collaborative framework. And how do we make sure, to, I think, Ted's point and a couple of other points made earlier in the day, that we don't misalign messages for the policymakers in that space? How do we have a consistent message that's not, one or the other, but all heads to the same outcome that's been sought? And
So in that sense, because I take Jit's point about, having a neighbours rating can improve the value of a property, but some neighbours ratings are also a way to show compliance with the National Construction Codes for energy and water efficiency, etc. So maybe some mandatory disclosure and falling in with the move towards mandatory disclosure for rental properties, for example, like for residential, might also be a way of encouraging beyond the voluntary codes that currently exist and have some very good standards, but can we make it for every building and arguably every space within a building when you have things like schools?
My decision.
I'd just add to, or comment on that, in our submission to the Commonwealth on the review of the Commercial Building Disclosure Program, we actually said that they should be mandated to report on indoor air quality. So,
Amanda, you
There was just really to go back to the incentive comment that you had made, and I think it just concerns me a little bit that you could end up with some environmental injustice happening, if that's the methodology that's sort of adopted. So I wouldn't be that comfortable, I think, with it being sort of a motivation for improving indoor air quality. So I think you could end up with some inequities. I don't know, that was a concern. Richard?
This reference to the mandatory disclosure and neighbours' energy. I think it's pretty thoroughly documented that innovation, that policy actually did push the energy performance of Australia's commercial building stock in the right direction. And so there is actually a neighbours' indoor environment tool that some of you may be aware of. And we get a bit of work out of it to do some measurements for them, but it's not perfect, and there's a bunch of parameters in there that you probably wouldn't be that interested in. But the concept is there, and my main beef with it would be the way that the actual measurements of IAQ are done. Under the current arrangements, you book an air quality consultant to come and have a look at your building one day. And then, of course, you get the facilities manager to tweak the system. So it's going to get a good rating. And then that report gets submitted, and then you turn it back business as usual. So we've been arguing, without much effect, but we've been long arguing that continuous pervasive measurement is the way forward.
Or random inspections of
Not random, is it? But given the quality of IoT status now, it's actually good enough to sustain continuous, have it all wired into the BNS system, so you've got a full record of everything.
Yeah, so questions from the floor?
Yes, no, I would agree with continuous monitoring. I've been monitoring indoor air quality in science labs for nearly 12 years. And what we found is that 97% of the time, the air is actually clean. It's just those incidents that happen now and again that is the problem. And I would anticipate the same would be in commercial buildings in general, that the air is generally clean for a lot of the time, but there are times when it isn't, and that's when you need to pick it up and score it. So a building might get a score out of 100, depending on the duration that these incidents have been happening, and so you'd be trying to get higher scores out of 100 for buildings so they can compete against each other and compare each other. I also see the climate crisis as an opportunity to do this. There's obviously going to be a need for deep renovations in our building stock. I think I counted 1 billion commercial buildings under this. And that deep renovation can be to reduce energy demand, but also improve climate resilience. But why not indoor air quality? Why can't that be done simultaneously at the same time as the deep retrofits? So that's another.
It raises a question or a discussion I had with Patrick much as well, that if some air quality sensors were mandated in buildings, that can actually help a building to understand how it's operating and improve its daily operation, regardless of whether you care about air quality or not. Anyway, it's a good means of managing the HVAC system.
And it would be a lot cheaper than getting like a contractor to come in and measure your outside airflows to see if you're still compliant as you were the day the building was handed over. A couple of sensors would be way cheaper. So I'm a mechanical engineer, I'm a stakeholder of the design industry, I guess, and I'm a very passionate advocate for indoor air quality. One of the things that I see, which I think needs to play into this complexity conversation, is indoor air quality is not one problem, it's a multitude of problems, and there are multitudes of solutions. And one solution might be very good for one type of the problem, like open your windows and you'll reduce your CO2 concentration and that'll help your cognitive, things. But in subtropical environments, that will proliferate mold. And mold is actually probably the biggest indoor air quality issue that I experience on a day-to-day in my professional circles. It's a very important thing. And there's a lot of technology and solutions to these things, but providing higher indoor air quality across all the different domains requires a lot of infrastructure that isn't currently done as normal practice, which increases costs of construction. And going right back to Ted's commentary, where it's very difficult to pass policy that affects people's pockets at the moment. That's one of the biggest constraints I feel. And it's not even the cost of the system going up, where we say, look, we need more chilled water, we need more this. The corresponding effects are higher space for substations, more area for plant rooms, all of these things. And then you start to have conversations with architects and they go, I'm not doing that. I don't believe you. And it's a really difficult conversation that we have at the precipice of trying to implement solutions. So we're welcome for the advice.
I think those conversations with architects are being had anyway as we try and move to net zero. You know, the plant room's going to look different. It's going to have to have, you know, higher rated floor loading capacity, you know, to take different plant equipment. And so there's an opportunity in all of that, I guess, you know, as we start to see the journey to net zero and electrification and some of the deep retrofits that people have spoken about.
Any other, perhaps have time for one more question from the floor?
TVOCs, there was some discussion around TVOCs. We found it to be very helpful in measuring, using, funnily enough, the German system of grade. But what we found with that was, unlike CO2, which we also use as a proxy, we found with TVOCs that we're able to determine. For example, we found off-gassing from plastic chairs. We found off-gassing from floor matting, for example, in a school. No one knew this existed. And then even mold, for example, will show up in the TVOC numbers. It's not specific, but we've been able to find these different parameters. It's a very helpful tool to measure and find things beyond what the ventilation is doing. Then you add PM 2.5, PM10, then you get a more holistic view when you look at that with CO2, with TVOC. And that's the whole point, to get a holistic view of what's happening. And when we've got a school or a building, the more sensors we can place 24/7, then we'll have the jigsaw puzzle. We'll see what's going on when we know what's going on. I think we have a better chance of remediating the solutions, because you might have this part of the building is fine, but not that part of the building. You have poor design of the ventilation system, for example.
Yes, thank you. It seems that you use it correctly. This is exactly what I said. TVOC is an excellent screening parameter to show there is something, okay? But just a positive one, not a negative. If there's a low TVOC, this doesn't mean that there are not any problems. Okay, that's important. But if there's a high TVOC value, you can see, okay, something, and now I have to search for the reason. Exactly what I said. Yeah.
Just one thing on my own personal experience with TVOC sensing is they drift. They need regular recalibration. And that's something that also is considered the sensors.
I think that's probably a consideration for all sensors is, do they get calibrated before they get put in? Do they get regularly recalibrated?
The TVOCs are particularly problematic.
We could discuss this for an hour, but if you're interested in TVOC, just to mention it, I have a big paper exactly on that topic from 2022 in Environment International. So is anybody interested in TVOC, you're happy to download this paper.
Yeah. I think given the time, we actually need to finish the questions now, but people will be around for a while. I'd like to thank our panellists, and please join me in taking questions. And just a reminder that one of the things for today was to give you what Thrive's proposal is regarding the State of Indoor Air report. So here's a pretend timeline of what we expect to do. So today was getting your input into our proposal, we expect, or I expect all my young colleagues to be working on the content of what quantifiable data do we have about indoor air quality in Australia. Over the next 5 or 6 months or so, we'll be getting some expert review of that draft. How much that report actually says about the trends or policy things, it may just be the quantitative stuff. This is what we know, and this is what we don't know. It may not be any more than that. We expect that report will be released possibly in October next year. And finally, there are some upcoming events. So there's been some interest, particularly in the mould thing. So just want to highlight that GUT has a PhD final seminar on next week, which is specifically on mould-affected housing. Lisa is a person who suffers from mould-related illnesses and has undertaken her PhD on the subjective experiences of systematic exposure to mould and the causes of mould from the perspectives of those people, as well as the perspectives of mould professions who go into the household, into buildings and measure that mould. So that PhD seminar is on Zoom. So, example of that is you should participate. Tonga will also be presenting a lecture mid-January about the predicting impacts of climate change on indoor air quality. And there's a number of future forums that Thrive are planning, no particular dates programs at the moment that wanting to look at indoor air quality and new public buildings, energy and indoor air quality, and schools and indoor air quality. So please stay tuned. And thank you all for your participation. Lydia, do you want to say any words before we go? Yes. No. Also, but yeah, to the moment. But I'm actually getting a part of it because it's hard. And it's like, this guy says,
Just to this is of course not a summary from the sections because there's no summary as such. We discussed what we are doing and the plans for what we are going to do. Just two very general comments, perhaps going beyond what we are doing in the state of indoor air, and then some specifics, more specifics how we are going to work. Something which was mentioned here and I think very important is consensus regarding policy advice in Australia. Of course, we are working in the same direction. We want to see proxies. We want better indoor air quality for all, but we may have different ideas about how to do it. And if we give different ideas, different opinions, what's supposed to be done, this will confuse policymakers. So while this is not necessarily the part of this report, but maybe that's something which should be considered, such that we are speaking one voice. Otherwise, we can derail this activity. So that's one. The second is the cost. That issue of the cost, well, it will cost so much that we cannot afford, so let's better don't talk about the cost. What I do when this conversation happens about the cost is such. We are not working for now, for today, not even for next year. We're working for the future. And we've got to make sure that, I'm saying that in 20 years from now, maybe early, but in 20 years from now, we won't have this problem. When we think back, when there was no plumbing system in buildings, it didn't happen in 1 year. All buildings in London, as it started, had already a plumbing system. So we've got to remind everyone, we are working for the future, and this may take time. And in the meantime, we are seeing how to improve the situation. But it is not all because by next year we'll have to improve all the buildings with the perfect ventilation. This is very important. So these are some general comments which I or thoughts which I developed in terms of what's going to be in the report, state of indoor air report. Of course, some will be facts, like when we presented facts. There were this many papers published, or this many papers, these are facts. But it's the question from this fact, we can draw lots of conclusions. And the question is what will extract from this and in a way that it is practical, reasonably practical, or what is the mess. So this brings us to the point, how are we going to work together? Because the importance is big important that we see one place. So we already, as we've mentioned, we already have partners, official partners in the report. But there's nothing stopping other organizations represented today here to be official partners of this. Now, official partners doesn't mean just putting your logo on the document, but it is being part of this activity. We haven't yet developed the detailed procedure, how it will be reviewed, how the consensus will be built. We'll have to work together on this. But it is the idea that it is not a document developed by a group of people at Thrive, but it is a consensus document of the Australian community on the state of Victoria for Australia. So that's something which will be working towards. We are hoping, well, we are not hoping, it's not a hope. I always like this quote from Hillary, hope is not a strategy. So it's not a hope. We will have a big event launch next year. So we already have a plan for this, but probably when it discussed because not finalized. But through the course of next year, we will have more events to discuss this, and the plan for this will be proposed. So with this, I'd like to thank you, everyone, starting with Wendy for preparing this, for guiding the students and postdocs, all those who presented. Of course, we have more students and postdocs who work on this, but not everybody could present. So thank you very, very much. Thank you all for you who came here, and big thank you to Chantal. That is here. Without Chantal and the patients, I don't think much would have happened, and I don't think my sanity would be where it is now. So thank you very much, Chantal. And thank you very much for Rafat, whose expertise in organizing undertakings like this is invaluable. So thank you very much for it, and thank you very much all.
Yeah.